remind us what it's like to be an American. When you grow up, you get kind of specific on what you believe, and you're not very flexible anymore. So you're still flexible, you're still learning. You can teach us a whole lot, the rest of us. Just like working on the wall and all that kind of stuff. You get two sides of the issue, and it's firm, and you can't have democracy unless you can have adaptation. And that's what I think we've forgotten. Some way we all think everybody can have their own way. Well, you can't do that in democracy. Sometimes I don't like it when I don't get my way, but I know with all my offspring, I've found out I can't have my way and still have my kinfolks.
So you say that people have forgotten what it means to be an American. What do you think it means to be an American? To you, what does it mean to be an American?
Well, of course, the thing that would immediately come to me is to believe so much in the principles of our Constitution that we are willing to die for our country if that were ever to be the case where we face that, and that was a case that I faced. And I had that tested, and to me, that's the first principle. If you have your country, you gotta be willing to preserve it and keep it, and the only way that can happen in the whole universe is to be willing to die for it. You gotta stand up and fight for your principles. Be principled is what is important in having your country. Have not only a personal purpose, but a purpose as a country serving well its citizens, and the citizens being committed to its principles. And historically, we have the Constitution, and because we had our forebears who believed in the freedom and independence of this country, they drew up a bill of particulars to live by, because if you don't have something that you can refer to, who's going to be in charge? Whether it's in your school, whether it's in your business, whether it's in your politics, nothing happens unless somebody's in charge. We always have to have people in whom we have trust and confidence in our leadership. Now that's a little bit hard for you to understand now, and it's a little bit hard for us to understand because the country is so divided. Rather than having differences of opinion which we reconcile, we just stand up and dare each other to do anything that we don't want them to do. You know, one thing about history, you can look back and see different stages of the history of our country and realize what can happen if you're together in your politics. During World War II, the country was committed almost 100% to the war. And it didn't matter whether you was a Democrat or Republican, you supported the war effort. And so we really, in one sense of the word, saved the world from dictatorship because we had that confluence of idealism, of commitment, of willingness to die for our country. And of course, I was one of those who was engaged, so I remember it well and support it. We stood behind our president, President Roosevelt. We stood as Democrats and Republicans, served on the same ship. We served in the same foxholes. Well, today you can't imagine Republicans and Democrats being that cooperative. They kill each other, I think. They've got such hatred sometimes for each other. I hope that's not totally true, that it's political, but it's awfully hard to see through it today. But some of the best politics, some of the best democracy that's ever been engaged in history was right after the end of the war, during the war, and right after the end of the war, because the Democrats and Republicans in Washington had all served together in the military. So when they had disagreement, they still loved each other. And I'll use that term because, you know, if you fought in the foxhole with somebody, I don't care what he was, Democrats, Republicans, black or white or blue, they were your brothers because they would die for you. And that's the essence of brotherhood, which is a terminology that you grow to understand better as you live your life. And I'm going to be 93 before long, so I've been through all those deliberations many times for your family and your neighbor and your fellow Marine if you were in the Marine Corps like I was. But what it means to me is to have a congregation of people, millions of them in the United States or France or wherever, with a common purpose. And without purpose, you know, you can't live a life very well. You can't live a community very well. You've got to want to have integrity. If you can't be trusted, and if you can't trust your neighbor, then you cannot have a citizenry with a democracy, because you can't trust anybody. So being a good citizen in democracy is trustworthiness, it's honesty, it's integrity, it's personal, it's self-confidence, it is all the education and knowledge you can get. Both of you are going to study engineering. That's hard stuff. But once you learn, then your purpose is going to be tied to what you've learned to a large extent, though most people don't end up being exactly what they may have planned to be when they were your age. When I was your age, I was flunking out of school, and I didn't get serious like you are until after the war. And I grew up, but I didn't have the same opportunity for education you had. But that word opportunity, citizenship should provide opportunity. And the citizens should be able to place confidence in the setting of their country, and that should be strongly administered. It's Congress, its leadership, and all citizens should participate in selecting their leaders, and then have confidence in the people they selected. That's hard to see right now for you because we've got a president that a lot of people don't support. I've lived long enough that I support whoever is president. I may decide to vote for one, but I'll support the other one, because you cannot have a country without a leader. And a leader that I may not like is better than no leader at all. If we could just instill that in everybody, and everybody stood with the leader, that person would be a lot better leader than if we're divided beside that leader. Well, those are just practical, everyday principles. It's like respecting your parents. You know, growing up, we know that our parents are not perfect. Now, we're not going to tell them that. But there is no perfection in human beings. But they are responsible for us as long as we're growing, and we're not going to be able to sustain ourselves without someone to love us and respect us and look after us. Little by little you grow up from that to become independent, and that's when your responsibility as citizens come about. Right now, you're not really responsible as citizens, but you're learning responsibility as young citizens, because you'll take over and you'll run this country. Now, it may be hard to envision, but it's true. Each generation takes over the democracy and makes it work. And each generation, we like to hope, does a better job than the prior generation fluctuates. Sometimes it's true and sometimes it isn't true. I don't know whether I've told you what you asked the question. What is what is a democracy, or what's the principles of the country? But responsibility is a good term to tie everything around. We're not free to be independent of responsibility. We're responsible to our parents, we're responsible to our teachers, we're responsible to our church. We have to feel a sense of responsibility, but as we grow up, we start challenging the relationships and why we're responsible, and whether what we've been taught to believe is exactly what we ought to believe. And little by little we become independent. We may carry with us a lot of what our parents have taught us and what we've learned in school and what we've learned in church. But then we become independent and we run for office and we're a congressman. Then we're representing the whole constituency out there. We're no longer free to think only for ourselves. We've got to think about our responsibility to everybody else. Everybody else may not want the country run the way we would like to see it run. So democracy is flexibility. Democracy is compromise. We're not seeing much of that. We're watching right now whether we're going to have a wall. And that's going to happen only if we have compromise. Or it's not going to happen because we have compromise or don't have it. So you're observing something that's unusual in history right now, I think. And in my 92 years of life, I've seen everything from the time the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor and I was 15 years old. Somebody came into the place I was working on the farm and said, "The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor." I was 15 years old. How old are you?
Almost 14.
Yeah, well, there you are. Someone came into you today and said, "Somebody has attacked the United States." Immediately I knew that I'll probably be involved in fighting a war, even though I was 15. And 2 years later, I was in the Marine Corps. Circumstances happen. You don't anticipate it, but if you're a citizen, you got to be prepared to defend your country. You got to make up your mind about what you really believe and whether citizenship is worth dying for. That's pretty vivid, but it's true. I speak a lot, and I speak to groups of young people, and the college students here. I lecture to groups, and I'm always asking, would you be willing to die for your country? Because there's no real possibility they're going to have to. But who knows? We didn't know it back in World War II or Korea or Vietnam. But young people grew up to the age of responsibility, and they went off to defend their country. So probably one of the greatest parts of democracy is willingness to defend what you have in which you can believe. And one thing to learn is that while we criticize everything about our own country, that the people stand in line from other countries to be citizens of this country. Very few citizens here stand in line to be citizens of some other country. So when we think we're not so good, we're better than the best. And that, you never forget that. As you grow up, you'll learn more about that, because you'll be a part of it. Anyway, maybe I'm rambling from your standpoint, but I've got a lot of depth of belief in my country.
That's good. You want to go, Ben?
So, you said in World War II, almost 100% of the country was behind the war and pushing for a better world and peace. So how do you think World War II changed our modern American culture, values, and our modern society?
Well, I think what World War II, in the end, after it was over, in reflection, it gave its citizens confidence in their capability as world leaders. The thing that we did that probably few other countries would have done based upon our history, our beliefs, our heritage, we decided to take two countries that were trying to take us and be dictators over us, Germany and Japan. They weren't just playing around. If they could have conquered us, they would have, and we would have been prisoners to their government. But once we won, we gave them a new start and funded the program of democracy in each of those countries. They were no longer under a dictatorial government. They were democratic in their governing. They governed themselves. We funded that. They were our enemies, but we did not force them to pay the price. We gave them an opportunity to make their country good for the citizens, which today we're all friends of democratic countries. They're great, strong countries. Their citizens are free. That's a great thing our country did for their enemies. We did not decide to destroy them because they opposed us. We decided to give them a new opportunity, a new life. That's the spirit of America. That's the spirit of democracy. That's the spirit of the willingness to forgive, and not only to forgive, but to give them all of the possibilities of sustaining themselves, their citizens, under a new kind of life. It's a little bit like all of us who fought for our country had the opportunity from the government to go to college, the GI Bill. Many of us who grew up in the country, we never dreamed of going to college. But after we served our country, they gave us a free education, which changed our lives. And I was a country boy, I could still been plowing corn, but because I got an education, I could be president of a university. That's the country that you want to have sustained, that will give you an opportunity to be the best that you can be, not to overpower you, not to push you into something you don't want to be, but give you an opportunity to be well educated, and then you can make a judgment of what you want to do. You can be prepared to lead. You can be a better person because of opportunity. I mean, I don't care how smart you are, if you don't have opportunity. The great thing about this country, it gives you opportunity. You're not suppressed. Now, if you walk down a dark street at night in the wrong part of a city, you can get your head blown off. I mean, you gotta have your good judgment. In any society, there are people who wish you ill, and there are people who wish you well. Overwhelmingly in this country, everybody you meet is gonna be a friend. In Africa, everybody you meet, an awful lot of them may not be your friends. Suppressed people all over the world who don't have a chance. And if you don't know that and you don't see that, you can't appreciate the greatness of this country, where you can get up here and leave and go where you please. You can judge to come here, and there's no one interfering with that. And that's the simple part of life that most of the time we don't stop and take into account, that we're free. Freedom is everything. Once your freedom is suppressed, you're no longer like a human being, you're just a robot. And so that's probably what democracy ought to guarantee you, to be free. And we who are veterans, we talk about freedom all the time. We fought to be free. We were willing to die to be free. That's what we were fighting for. A country that would allow us to be who we are, when we are, where we are, and what we are. You have that opportunity. And I would shout that from the rooftops, that the most important thing of all is freedom, and that's why we sometimes have wars, to keep from being suppressed. That's what my war, World War II, was all about. And we saved the world. We didn't just save ourselves. We were unselfish in our approach when we were fighting. We weren't fighting to subjugate all of the people. We were fighting to free their people, to get rid of their leaders who were dictating what their lives would be. I hope you understand all that.
Enough. How do you think the Great Depression affected your generation?
It was had a tremendous impact on our lives. You probably haven't heard this much, but growing up, I remember hearing about wealthy people in New York jumping out of their 32-story buildings because the stock market crashed and they didn't have any money anymore to kill themselves. But I remember that it wasn't just wealthy people who were losing all their monies, which was why they were killing themselves. People on the farms in the country who had mortgages. My father's father had a farm. It was heavily mortgaged. He couldn't sell the crops at a price to pay for the mortgage, so they took his farm away from him. My mother's father had a farm, and they couldn't pay the bills, so they took their farms away from them. That happened all over the country. People could not pay their bills, and they just sort of lived from hand to mouth. You couldn't sell your product if you were raising corn and tobacco or cotton. And if you couldn't sell your product, you didn't have any money to pay for your house. So people had to move out of their houses because the circumstances where they couldn't pay the bills. That was the Great Depression. I grew up, my father was a tenant farmer. His father had lost the farm, so he had to go to work when he was 12 years old, and that happened many times. Didn't finish grade school. And then I grew up with him working on the farm. And we had the economics of it you probably wouldn't understand, but when you think a family of 7 people, there were 4 of us children, my grandmother lived with us, my father and mother, and we lived in a tenant house, didn't even have a foundation under it. Cracks in the floor, but it was something over our heads, and he worked for $30 a month to feed the family. Well, that was typical, and it was such that you just couldn't hardly find a job. You took whatever you could get, and the government was supporting a lot of the people because they couldn't support themselves. And that's really what the Great Depression was all about. The economics of the country just were in turmoil. And if you couldn't find a job, you couldn't buy your food, and the government started giving people food. A lot of the people in the country where I grew up. My dad would never take it because he didn't believe in it. He wanted to earn to make a living, but he just barely made it. But I remember seeing people coming from the little town getting bags of government handout. My dad would never take a government handout. It's a different perspective. He had too much pride for that. But that was true all over the country. People in the cities, lawyers, dressed with their tie and all, they would go out in the morning as if they were going to their office. They end up on the street selling apples or selling newspapers. But they had too much pride to let people know that. They still let their neighbors think they were doing their job as lawyers. Educated people, teachers, a lot of the school systems closed up. They couldn't afford to operate. So kids were staying home. They didn't have any income. They could find very little. I remember when I was a teacher working for a nickel an hour. Well, today that wouldn't get you very far. I remember working for a neighbor one day for 5 hours, and I earned 25 cents. During the middle of the afternoon, I've never forgotten this. The neighbor who was to pay me brought me a cold bottle of orange drink. Well, I was looking forward to that quarter, but that afternoon when I finished and he paid me, he said I deducted a nickel for the drink. I never forgot that. That nickel was so important to me. I thought he was giving me a drink, but he was letting me pay for it. That's how tight money was. And so that probably says more to you than any other one thing. If you can't have money, I never had money to take to school. I took biscuits and jam. That was back in the Depression years. If you read stories about the Great Depression, the Okies going to California trying to find a job, that was all true. That's reality if you live through it. Just like you as young men when I was your age, I was living through that. And so it's still real in my mind, but there's the economics of our country today. It's hard to imagine that can happen, but it did happen, and we lived through it. The thing that cured it all, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. They not only destroyed our ships, they destroyed the Great Depression, because our democracy immediately rose up to fund the war and the economic circumstances of everybody had a job immediately. All of those didn't have a job went in the military. And it was a dynamic economy that grew out of that, so that we were a strong nation, and by the time the war was over, we were the strongest nation ever in history. And we prevailed at that in a real way, because even today our military is still the strongest one in the world, and it's why we've survived. People look upon us as being a strong country. We have a strong military. If we didn't have a strong military, we would not be free. There are a couple of other strong militaries in this world. If we ever got weak, we would be suppressed by them. There's always somebody who's going to be stronger than somebody else. And being prepared for war is probably the best way not to have it. Because what would we have to gain today if Russia, China, and America went to war? We just blew each other up. So you've got to stand independent and strong and hope that you're wise enough to negotiate outside of your democracy with those governments that are even different and they don't have democracies. But that's even more reason why our example as a great democracy still prevails to the people all over the world, though we may have debatable circumstances in our democracy. It's still the best government anywhere by any measure. That's my message.
Will, do you want to do? So, you said that after the war was over, it was like everyone had like a can-do mindset. Like they felt like our country could do anything.
Yeah.
So, how do you think that mindset like affected the decades past the 40s and 50s?
The decades following,
Yeah,
Mhm.
following.
well, I think it was the reason why we could make possible Germany and Japan rising to the countries they became, because we believed so strongly in our capabilities, and we were so willing to invest in their futures that strength multiplied into the world, and the whole world benefited. People looked to America for their salvation. That was true everywhere in the world. And self-confidence, belief in our democracy, strong financial base, and even from a religious perspective. Back in those days, we used to call it religious America, because everybody went to church. There's exceptions to that. I'm exaggerating a little. But it's pretty true that people were very much involved in the churches. They believed in the spiritual dimension of goodwill toward fellow man. Their integrity was related to their belief in God. And that's not gone, certainly, but it's not as obvious in the society as a whole. Back in those days on Sunday morning, most people, certainly lots of people, went to church. That doesn't mean necessarily they were better than they are today. It meant they did have a value system that was measured by their beliefs, and they had certain commitments of love and fellowship and goodwill and doing good in the world, whatever you could define that as. Doing good in the world in somebody's mind may not be the same as somebody else's, but goodwill to each other, helping the poor, trying to be balanced in a leadership situation. Back in those days, black people were suppressed in a very great way when I was a young man. Though on the farm we had blacks and whites working together in farm work during the Depression. We were very much in the same boat in many ways, but they didn't have the same educational opportunities. Today, well, there would be certainly people who questions whether they still have that, but the dramatic change of recognition that there ought not to be any lack of suppression or lack of support for any citizen of all kind by every definition. And that's changed an awful lot over the years. So those of us who've lived a long time ago, there's strange kind of terminologies in this day and time compared to what we understood or even accepted. But again, America still adapts and adjusts to the circumstance of people seeking to find a way to give everyone his or her right recognition and to acknowledge what's good about everybody, and that's extending your mind from where I was born into lots of new dimensions I never dreamed of. But that's what democracy is all about. That's what goodwill is all about. That's what freedom to be who you want to be is all about. If you're different, you would be a strange feeling person if you were treated differently. People want to have the same opportunities, whatever they are, whoever they are, within the definition of what we tolerate in our society. If you're a criminal, we're not going to treat you like anybody else. You're going to be in prison. So there are lines drawn to society. We all define ourselves. We have to finally determine what's the extent that you can do this, that, or the other and still not be disrupting the good of everybody else. And so you have to live with prisons, and there's no perfect society. There's no perfect person. And the best way in the world to make it work out is to have a vote and let the majority rule. And that's what democracy is all about. And hope everybody participates. And as soon as you're old enough, start voting. Then you feel like you're a part of everything. Sometimes it ends up being an anathema to lots of people if you've got a president that half of the country don't like. That's not an easy thing sometimes to live with. They don't recognize the other half likes. but you gotta tolerate that during that period of time. And you can elect somebody else next time. Well, I hope you got some ideas anyway.
Yeah.
If you're gonna be an athlete, same thing's true. You have to dedicate yourself. Purpose, everything requires purpose. And I know you wouldn't be here if you didn't have purpose. You got a parent here helping you do that too. Well, I'm proud of you.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Always good to see young people, and that I've had so many offspring. You know, 9 of my 11 grandchildren all graduated here at the University of Richmond. All 5 of my children graduated here.
Really?
It's a great university. And now I've got 11 great-grandchildren. I would be surprised if we don't have some of them sitting here in the chair in a few years saying, great-grandpa, I want to come to Richmond, so it'll be all right too.
Well, maybe we can get these two here.
Well, that's